Hi, I'm Bryn Griffiths, your Labour Left podcast host, and today I'm delighted to welcome a leading figure of the British left, John McDonnell, to the show. John's a final internationalist standing with the people of Iran, Iraq, Ukraine, Gaza, to name but a few. He first came to prominence as the Greater London Council's finance chair during the 1980s rate capping battle, and more recently he was Jeremy Corbyn's shadow chancellor. But perhaps his finest hour was back in 2024 when Andrew Fisher, his former staffer, added him to the Labour Left podcast Class Hero Halls of Fame. John, you're an excellent guest for the Labour Conference edition. How are you doing?
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me on. Thank you very much. Thank you to Andrew Fisher. That's quite flattering for Andrew.
Yeah, you're up there with the greats. James Connolly, Fidel Castro, Thomas Paine, Fred Hampton, Tony Benn, Francesca Albanese.
Well, I don't come up to the ankles of any of them anyway.
Well, you seem to have made a big impact on your old staffer, Andrew. I imagine the readers are thinking, the listeners are thinking, well, John, what's his status? Any news on your whip removal? Any indication of when we might learn more? What's happening?
Nothing. I'm still without the whip. The new chief whip has just recently been appointed, Johnny Reynolds, who used to be in my treasury team, if you recall. So I dropped him a line, and I said, look, I don't want to cause you a tricky problem in your first week, but I think we should have a discussion about the whip. And I said, actually, it's not just about me, it's about the others who've lost the whip as well. And I said, I think I'm more concerned about them, that we resolve this and that we're able to move on. Johnny, to give him his due, wrote back and say, yes, let's try and resolve this. So I've dropped him a note saying we better all meet up and see if we can find some accommodation and move forward. You know my view on all of this, that the reason the whip is there is just to smooth the business of the Commons, to make sure people are turning up and make sure people know what the party line is. But it's never in the past, certainly it wasn't under Tony Blair or Gordon Brown or Ed Miliband, it was never used as a threat, that you'd lose the whip or something like this.
I thought we'd just clear that up at the start, but I'd like to start.
We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, good luck, John. I think that there's many of us in the Labour movement that are with you. Let's have a look at your politics. What makes the man behind John McDonnell? And I loved listening to your podcast, A People's History. And I wonder whether that tells us something about a history from below approach and whether that gives us a clue about where you're coming from politically.
The reason I did that series of podcasts, because I was worried about the lack of political education that was taking place within the Labour Party in particular, but more broadly too. And I wanted people to understand the long history that there is of people standing up for their rights in this country, but also the long history of revolt and revolution in this country too, well in advance of some other European countries, actually. So I went right back to the People's Revolt and then went through the Civil War period and Chartists, etc. You name it. And I just got historians together. But the lesson for me, and I suppose it mirrors my own political development, I'm very much a grassroots person. I'm very much a grassroots politician. I never had any ambition to become an MP or anything like that. And like most of us, I sort of got involved in local issues, talking to local people, discussing different ideas about how we want to change our local community. Then that led you on to how we want to change our society, our country. That leads you on to how you want to change the world. And it's like that sort of evolution from the grassroots politics that I've developed. And that's why I wanted to demonstrate in that series of histories, that actually individuals coming together can be immensely powerful and actually can change the world. So yeah, that's the nature of my politics and how it's evolved, definitely.
Looking back in history again, what about Marx? Because I saw in 2018, you went to the Marx Memorial Library and spoke at the big man's 200th anniversary of his birthday. What does Marx bring to your political practice?
What happened with me is, as I got involved political activity in my constituency in Hayes, obviously you naturally have a group of people around you, you discuss ideas. And one of the things that we did, literally, it was in the kitchen of a close friend of mine, and council house kitchen, there was a dozen of us local activists. We just read the Communist Manifesto together, a small booklet, but it was an explanation of the history of class struggle. And importantly, it was an explanation of the development of capitalism. So I suppose just reading that Communist Manifesto, I know that sounds relatively sort of a naive, but actually it was mind-changing, because what it did is it developed the ideas about this is how our economic system operates under the capitalist system. This is the history of struggles to combat the iniquities of capitalism and the oppression and exploitation it brings about. And here's how you can develop your ideas into, well, socialist practice. And it's a short little booklet, but then it led you on to other works of Marx itself. And the issue around Marx, and this came out of the banking crisis, in 2008. Marx is the best analyst of how capitalism works. And the reason I mentioned the banking crisis, because when the banking crisis occurred, there was a revival of an interest in Marx because of his thorough understanding of the mechanisms of capitalism.
Mark Carney have an interest in Marx?
Yes, he did. Well,
for people that don't know, he's the former governor of the Bank of England.
It is Mark Carney, but when I was Shadow Chancellor, I would meet Mark Carney as the governor of the Bank of England, and we'd meet about once a month, and we'd have a discussion about the current situation in the economy, what the bank was doing, what its aims were, and the role it was playing. He's now leader in Canada, but he's extremely well read. I'd read Marx as well, so there was interesting enough a few ideas thrown into the discussions about analysis of capitalism as it was. Interesting enough, where it led Mark Carney was an interest in the environment and the impact of how our economic system was affecting the environment overall. And what he was trying to do was to place the environment on the agenda, particularly in the discussions within the City of London, how our natural resources were limited and being destroyed as a result of the way our economic system was operating. I found that really interesting as the governor of the Bank of England. This is an anecdote, but on the day of the general election, 2019, Mark phoned me at lunchtime and he said, I just want to assure you that whatever the outcome of the general election, if you are elected, the Bank of England will stand behind you, because there was all sorts of rumours that there'd be a run on the pound and that sort of thing.
Probably the most influential Marxist for me is Antonio Gramsci, and I couldn't help but note that Fergal Kinney, who's the Tribune culture editor, described you as the Gramscian backbencher. That's a very grand title. Are you happy with that?
Well, remember, Gramsci his works were published quite late in this country. So they became, certainly for my generation, I think, the generation of New Left thinkers, the New Left Review, and then the publication of Gramsci's prison notebooks were important, because at that stage, the left was looking for what route they could develop under late capitalism to develop a socialist society. The discussions were moving on from revolutionary socialism in terms of what Gramsci called war of maneuver, charging up against the Winter Palace and all this sort of thing, sort of Bolshevik attempts at physical revolution. And it was more then what Gramsci was developing for the late stage of capitalism was this war of this development of position, really, war of position. So in other words, sort of how you would develop an economic analysis and political analysis society that was held to be completely rational and reasonable by the majority of working class people, that would then enable you to develop a political practice that would enable a socialist government to be elected, but more importantly, a socialist movement to be developed that then could dramatically transform the economy and society. So in some ways, the discussions around Gramsci for individuals like me who are working within the Labour Party in particular, this was how you could actually develop a revolutionary practice that actually could transform society, but do it in a way that reflected the structure, the political structures that we had, and also the balance of economic power within late capitalism itself. I think Gramsci's work sort of reinvigorated a lot of the discussions and debates that we were having. And it did relate back to what Tony Benn was doing, which was developing socialist practice based upon also the history of socialism within our country and drawing upon the history of revolutionary practice in our country. Individual struggles were about incremental achievement of democratic rights that then developed into the incremental achievement of economic influence and power. The other person at the time as well who was trying to give advice and assistance in how to develop political practice from a socialist perspective within late capitalism was Mandel, of course, Ernest Mandel, of course, but also Ralph Miliband.
He had a thing or two to say about capitalist crisis, didn't he?
Exactly. And if you look at his works, his development of concept of late capitalism and the crisis-ridden nature of capitalism, if you look at those works, they educated us into just how opportunities would arise for socialists to convince people of the need for change and what the potential for change was. What Mandel and others were trying to explain to people was crises were inherent within capitalism itself. What Gramsci was trying to do is give us the opportunity of a different type of politics, which would be ready to explain those crises, and then give us a form of political practice that would enable us then to, within that crisis, to develop on socialist practice within a democratic system of electing of a government and then transforming society.
Was John McDonnell preparing for a march through the institutions of civil society in a Gramscian sense if you'd become Chancellor?
Yeah, exactly that. Every time on the left, I would say to people, the left has to be ready to go into power tomorrow. You have to understand how the system works. You have to know what your objectives are, and you have to have an understanding of the practices that you need to put in place to achieve those objectives. And that means looking at the institutions of capitalism and the institutions of the state. Miliband, I think, was incredibly influential on many of us about his analysis of the state. I disagreed with him about his views about the Labour Party and its opportunity. I think actually changed in his last book anyway. But for me, it was trying to get a thorough understanding of just how you can move forward, how you can develop your ideas into practice. And that's why you've mentioned my position on the GLC. We developed for the GLC, a number of us, the idea of in and against the state, very Gramscian. It was a group that came together, and I thought it was fundamentally important for the time it was in. And it basically was saying this: the state is a set of institutions, but it's also a relationship. So the theory that we were developing was that go within those institutions and change the relationship. And the relationship of the state is one of dominance. You can see it in every aspect of its work. So we were encouraging people, go within the state either as a job, an official, or go in elected office. And then when you get in there, change the relationship from dominance into one of democratic, powerful working class people. And that was the theory behind the GLC. Get elected to the GLC or be appointed into an official role, and then literally, and this is what we did at the GLC, we just opened the door to County Hall and said, come in with your ideas. We'll give you the resources and the power to implement those ideas. And it's all about transfer of power to working class people in every aspect we possibly could. And I think in many ways that was the development of the ideas of what we should be doing nationally if we had got elected as a Labour government. But it demonstrated a form of political practice that sort of prefigured the sort of society we wanted to create.
But what the GLC showed for me was that the left is serious about power. It's serious about opening up the institutions of the state and bringing the people in. And we showed at the GLC that we can do it in practice. And you and Ken were so instrumental in showing that.
I always used to say to my Socialist Campaign Group colleagues, you've got to understand the system. You've got to be ready to go in there into government. And you've also, when you go into government, you've got to have in your back pocket your manual about how the system operates and how you're going to change it and what the first steps are. Sounds terribly bureaucratic, but you have to do these things if you're going to change.
You're speaking to a former bureaucrat, John. I was a senior official in local government until I retired a few years ago. So the importance of having people that understand how to make the institution actually move and do what you want it to is not lost on me, I can assure you. When I came across you, what I remember and what I still think about when I think about John McDonnell is the Irish struggle. I want to know why to this day you're still active in the Labour movement for Irish unity.
I was born in Liverpool from an Irish Catholic family, basically. My grandparents were Irish, came across to Liverpool, and so we're sort of very much a traditional Irish Catholic background in that sense. And I look on Ireland as part of my history and homeland. Interesting enough, as I became a teenager, in school you were never really taught about Irish history at all, or if you were, it was from a very much a British colonial perspective, basically.
You might learn about Oliver Cromwell. That was about it when I was
exactly. Yeah. Well, my family's from Drogheda, so we're not very keen on Oliver Cromwell.
A better role in Britain when he sort of stuck up for the Parliament.
Well, you know what Frank Dobson said. He chaired the Cromwell Society, and Frank used to say, "Look, Cromwell was a bastard, but he was our bastard." And I'd say to Frank,
I don't think the Irish would agree with that.
No, that's what I said to Frank. He might have been yours, but he wasn't mine, coming from Drogheda, where we were massacred. What happened was, as I went into my sort of teenage years and beyond, just got more interested in reading about Irish history. And then as soon as you read about Irish history, and you just see that form of oppression that took place over the hundreds of years. But then actually you see the mechanisms used in Ireland are used through the development of imperialism right the way across the globe by the British state, but also by other countries as well. So that's how I developed into it. I was interested in Irish culture and Irish reading lots of Irish writers. I found it offensive that lots of Irish writers would be classified in the libraries under the English section. So a few of us would use a sticker, move the books from George Bernard Shaw and others, Oscar Wilde, and we move them out and put a sticker underneath, Irish section, not English. It was just that cultural dominance, wasn't it, really, that took place. At that point in time, the Troubles were there. We had the hunger strike, Bobby Sands dying. And so I sort of got drawn into the Irish politics. At the GLC, what we tried to do, as you know, we tried to make sure we had a whole range of equalities policies implemented. And one of the issues we looked at is the diversity of London. And so we had groups working in different communities. And we set up an Irish unit, an Irish team working within the Irish community. And it was to develop and support the Irish community in London, which were going through tough times at the time. There were still high levels of discrimination against Irish people. If you remember, we had the Evening Standard running abusive adverts about the Irish, which was appalling. And then, of course, that led us on to the discussions of the Troubles. And the interest of the Irish community in London at that point in time was how can we secure peace? Because there was bombs going off in London. And I was the first person to put up a motion to the GLC Labour group that we should start entering into talks with Sinn Féin, inviting Sinn Féin councillors over, just to talk about the situation of what was happening in the north, and then how we could help move things forward. I put up a resolution that we should be seeking to talk about peace. And you can imagine what the reaction was. Even Standard ran a campaign. We were abused by all and sundry. How dare we talk to Sinn Féin? I organised a tour of Sinn Féin councillors around the London councils.
I remember Danny Morrison in that period had a fantastic article in London Labour Briefing.
Brilliant writer.
Give us peace. Give us peace. That was the message that he wanted to have a dialogue around.
Yeah, Alex Maskey came over and we toured around the London councils, talking directly to the council meetings about how we could secure peace. And what happened to Alex is that he went back to Belfast and was shot 4 times, incredible, but survived, and eventually became mayor in Belfast. So again, what happened was we were trying to just engender an atmosphere where you could actually understand how the Irish were feeling about their treatment in London, but then how that led to a discussion about the need for peace overall. Interestingly enough, or even though the media condemned us, and even though the Labour Party nationally distanced themselves from us, we now know that those talks with Sinn Féin were going on behind the scenes under a Thatcher government.
Yes.
Extraordinary period. So yeah, I've kept up.
Can I just ask you a question about, bring it back to today on Ireland? Yeah. When I had Jeff Bell from your campaign, the Labour Movement for Irish Unity campaign, on the show, he talked about one of the components of reconciliation is the truth, and telling the truth about what the British state did during that period. Yeah. What's your view on that, John?
It's a bit like South Africa, you know, where they had that Truth Commission, where people were able to come and tell their stories on all sides, on all parts of the community as well. And I think that's fundamental because it helps us learn the lessons of what went on, learn the lessons of history for the future. And it does, you can have breakthroughs when you establish the truth like this. And you know what comes out of it is that no matter what side you're on, there were shared experiences that you never want other people to go through again. It's like that. And in many ways, it's the first step towards bringing a community together. At the moment, so you've mentioned the Labour for Irish Unity. At the moment, I've been doing meetings at the TUC, we'll have meetings at the Labour Party conference. We've just have discussions about how we can now prepare the ground in our country, in England, Wales and Scotland, for enabling the next step in enabling the Irish people to decide their own future. And the next step will be the poll with regard to the border. Now, some of the stuff that we're planning is how do we, first of all, bring the Irish community, the diaspora in this country together to talk about what their views are and what their intentions are, but then making sure that that broadens out to a much wider discussion of raising the levels of awareness in this country about the developments in Ireland. Because in Ireland itself, a dynamic is developing which is about Irish unity. And we need to reflect that here. Why do we need to reflect that here? Is because Westminster, this UK Parliament, will set the terms about the decision on when that poll about the border should be brought about. So the work we're doing at the moment is to start raising the level of awareness in this country about the debate that's happening in Ireland. And then I hope under this Labour government, because it's got such a large majority, that under Keir Starmer or the Labour government that's in place now, they can then set the terms, the criteria upon which the poll can go ahead. And I actually do think the poll will reveal that there is a sizable majority now for United Ireland peacefully achieved.
Jeff Bell, when he appeared on the show, asked all Labour members at their constituency meetings where you've got a Labour MP to ask them, what is the route map to a poll taking place in Ireland so they can determine their own future? Because I think Ireland drops off the agenda for many Labour politicians, and it's so important that the Good Friday Agreement is implemented. An important contribution we can make is to get every MP to think about that question. What is the route map to a poll on the question of Irish unity? Because that was promised in the Good Friday Agreement if there was an indication the Irish people wanted it.
Jeff's exactly right, but there's a sense of urgency now. The sense of urgency is this, is that we're fearful that a reform government could be elected. We've just seen that reform is quite capable because of what it's been saying about the EHCR, which is an element of the Good Friday Agreement. They're quite capable of tearing up that Good Friday Agreement. So there's a sense of urgency that whilst we have this Labour government with such a sizable majority, over the next couple of years, it could move this agenda over very quickly to reflect what's happening in Ireland. If we get a reform government, we will be going back decades, and that's dangerous. And the issue is that for Labour MPs, they have to recognise that if awareness is raised amongst the Irish diaspora, the Irish communities within their constituencies. You know what the population is like in this country. There's a large Irish population here that could be, if they're motivated in such a way, that could form the difference between whether some Labour MPs get elected or not. And so what we're trying to say to Labour MPs, look, wake up to the fact that the Irish within your constituency have an interest here. They will express that interest, and they will expect you to listen to them and also come to a view that they think is the right one, which is about supporting Irish unity. So there's an element of a sense of urgency here. So the work that we're doing for Labour for Irish Unity now is working with a whole range of other organisations, particularly Irish community organisations, to raise the level of debate, raise the level of awareness, and then focus it more on Westminster with a Labour government in power to say, look, you need to get a shift on that, otherwise we'll miss this opportunity and we could go backwards rather than go forwards.
Did you see George Osborne's podcast recently, where he was musing on what might have happened if you and Jeremy had got us over the line in 2017 when it really happened, when it nearly happened. And he was wondering aloud what the British establishment would do. George has been a bit frank there, isn't he?
Yeah.
Do you think the British establishment were having conversations about how they'd get rid of you and Jeremy if you got us over the line in 2017?
I'll tell you an anecdote first. When Jeremy decided to stand, we worked very hard. We had a week to get Jeremy onto the ballot paper, and John Lansman and I put together a team, and we worked solidly. Nominations had to be in by Monday lunchtime, 12 o'clock. Came to Sunday evening, and we'd worked so hard. We'd covered every MP. We'd spoken to their families, their friends, to anything that would influence their union in the end. Anyway, it got to about 6:30, something
Andrew
like that.
Fisher said you nearly wore your knees out at one point.
did.
You were on your knees begging, John.
Was. On one occasion, I was, it's true. And it worked. In the last 10 seconds, the nomination went in. Anyway, that Sunday night, my wife and I had booked to go to the Globe to see one of these Shakespeare plays where there's bodies lying all over the place, you know. And at the, I got a message from Seb Corbyn, Jeremy's son, who'd been working for me because he's a brilliant young lad anyway. And he said, look, Dad's worried. Yeah, this is in the middle of the break in the play. And he said, Dad's worried we might win. He's worried. And I said, yeah. I said, don't worry. I said, don't worry. I said, tell him MI5 will execute him before he gets anywhere near number 10 anyway. And to be honest, they might not have wanted to do it physically, but they certainly tried to do it in terms of the smears and all the rest that they leveraged against him. I think we knew that, we knew we were up against the establishment, and we knew that everything would be thrown against us. So what do you do to try and combat that? You become more skillful than them. That's first of all. That means understanding the system, how it works, and having different options and different policy positions that enables you to strengthen, put those sort of robust ramparts around your administration. But secondly, you build a mass movement, and that's what we were trying to do. And if you think of it, when we went into 2017, even 2019, actually, we had built quite a mass movement of popular support. And so it would have been very difficult. So it would have been very difficult for this establishment to remove us. But what they would do is chip away and undermine us. And to a certain extent, that's what they did. You know, I joke about it, but a lot of my time was basically spent on fending off coups that were taking place, launched within the PLP and elsewhere.
I've got a question about that, John. My old boss, Reg Race, and your former mate, possibly, at the GLC, who was a very strong former ally of the left. And he wrote a really interesting book. Well, it was interesting to me because he was my boss. So I wanted to hear his life story. Goodbye to the Working Class, it was called. I think he was talking about the class composition of British politics, not his new political orientation, but Reg can explain that. And Reg wrote, and I found this fascinating, and I haven't seen it picked up anywhere else. He wrote that key figures behind the MP's chicken coup to remove Jeremy Corbyn in 2016 briefly considered another tactic, and their idea was to mount a coup in Parliament. They briefly considered, and Reg should know because he was in the inner sanctum of the group that was doing the planning on this. He said they considered creating a new party within a party and telling the House of Commons Speaker that Jeremy was no longer the leader of the opposition. And they even toyed at one point, although figures in the Co-op party that they spoke to weren't interested, of using the Co-op party as a potential vehicle to do this. What do you make of Reg's claim in the book? Do you think it's plausible?
Reg to me is a bit of a tragedy because he was a brilliant left-wing MP. He really was.
He was up with that.
His oratory was excellent. He was able to motivate and he think things through. And I don't know what happened to him. I still can't understand it now. The way his politics changed so dramatically over a period of time. Anyway, my view is that literally we were having to deal with plots and coups every week. There was something coming out, and part of my job was to try and see that what was coming along, how we could fend that off. And the best way of doing that really is to divide the plotters amongst themselves and see who we could bring on board, etc. How we could neutralize them as much as we possibly can.
That's like one of those war of positions again.
It was just continuous though. I'll give you an example. I persuaded Jeremy that Lisa Nandy, an up-and-coming young woman on the left, needed a good brief to give her a profile, because I thought she'd be one for the future. So we gave her the environment brief, which I thought was really superb. But within about 3 months of her being given that brief, she was in meetings that were talking about the first coup against Jeremy Corbyn. I called her in. I said, "Why are you doing this?" And she denied it. And I said, "Well, I'm afraid it's accurate because I had someone in that meeting reporting back to me." In the end, and she's denied all this. And then she was one of the organisers of the chicken coup. If you remember, they went to see Jeremy, the group of them, urging him to stand down. And Jeremy, nice guy that he is, invited them all in to have a conversation about it. And then I went round and said, "You're not having it. Off you go. This is ridiculous." But that was happening all the time. The most dangerous element of this, and they did it over the issue around Brexit, one idea was to split the Labour Party, and so there'd be a sort of a rump of the left.
A sort of Ramsay MacDonald national government relive.
Well, they would either become the sort of official opposition because numerically they were bigger than what was left of those of us with Jeremy, or they would link up with the Tories in some form, and it would be a national type government. And that was always the problem. They'd split off. My big worry, and it was over the Brexit issue largely, my big worry was that those people around the people's vote who had big money would fund them and support them. And we could be in a situation where the Parliamentary Labour Party is split, and Jeremy and I and our team would be in a minority. So I did everything I possibly could, and to link up even with people like Alistair Campbell. To give him his due, I think he saw the dangers of it as well. And I was trying to make sure that Amuna group never got bigger than it did. And we didn't. We neutralized them to a certain extent. But that took a lot of talking to the devil, really, in with regard to Campbell and others, but that had to be done, The British establishment works. Wouldn't be a direct, we'll send in the troops or something like that. It would simply be working through the existing systems, and they knew that one way of bringing Jeremy down was to undermine his position via the PLP and then try to undermine it within the wider party. What we tried to do is manage the PLP as best we could, split them up, try and do a broad church approach, which we believed in anyway, but at the same time appeal over their heads to the membership. And the membership did stay with us throughout, which was quite interesting. Within the PLP, we managed it for a bit, but it was tough. And some of those Parliamentary Labour Party meetings were horrific. It was the worst meetings I've ever been in, where they did their assault on Jeremy.
So you think a real risk, if you and Jeremy had got into government, probably 2017 was our best chance. Do you think there was a real risk that if the establishment was putting the Labour government under huge pressure, sections of the PLP might have been tempted by Reg's scenario?
It wouldn't have been the traditional establishment coup, in the sense, that like under Harold Wilson, we now know that the military were looking at a coup at one point in time. That's been proven. it wouldn't have been the traditions like that. And under Wilson, there was a lot of smears and stuff like that to destabilise him. I don't think it would have been anything like that. I think the strategy would have been, just as it was before the election, to try and split the PLP and then undermine the government by not having a parliamentary majority. As simple as that. The way to overcome that was get into power and start delivering popular policies immediately, so that you're building up support within the wider community. And therefore, those who were looking at splitting the PLP or whatever would realise, actually, if there was an election, they wouldn't get back. We'd be re-elected on the basis of the policies we undertook. If you look at Ralph Miliband's last book, he addresses, this is in his dying days, tragically, he addresses the potential of a socialist government being elected and what they would need to do immediately to make sure they had a momentum of support. And it was around very straightforward measures, bread and butter issues that working people faced, getting money into their pockets, tackling poverty, getting the housing program going, making sure the public services were improved, all of those sorts of things. And that was our program, basically. Get elected, and then literally within months, pouring out policy after policy that people would see was changing their lives. In that way, any attempted coup would be defeated, because if we had to, we'd go to the country again and say, right, we're going to call election, and we'll go to the people on the policy program that we've implemented so far.
Fascinating stuff, John. And if any of the younger watchers and listeners haven't read Chris Mullin's book, A Very British Coup, or watch the film on Channel 4, you've got to watch it, and then you'd know what me and John were on about if it hasn't been immediately obvious today. We've got to talk about Gaza, John. Let's watch you put your view over in Parliament in December 2024.
Which is the use of counter-terrorism powers against direct action groups, and the last government even came forward with proposals and discussions about prescribing Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. I'm hoping the government isn't even going anywhere near that. But I tell you, these people that are in prison at the moment, why are they in remand at the moment? Why can't they be tagged before their trial comes up next November? A number of them most probably will be proved innocent, but they'll have served nearly 2 years in prison. For what? For trying to do what we're failing to do, preventing this government supplying the arms to a regime that's killing children. So I say to the government, it's time to act now. All arms licences need to be closed down. And if it's a matter, as the Honourable Gentleman says, well, it's about defending Israel, well, let's have a conversation with Israel itself about how you supervise that defence internationally, rather than using that as an excuse to kill children. I've had enough of coming back here every week, as you can tell, Chair. We need now action from this government.
Thanks for doing that, John. When you speak in Parliament, it's so important for us, those of us in the Palestinian movement. We appreciate every word that you and the campaign group say on moments like that. I want to ask you, what is you spoke very eloquently there. What is the cause of our government's terrible approach? Is the Labour rights Atlanticism, the tying of their foreign policy to the United States, the root of Starmer's policy on Gaza?
I think there's a range of factors, really. One, it's historical, the role of the British Empire within the Middle East over the last couple of centuries, really. So it's tied to that inherited policy making that's taken place, which enabled the foundation of Israel and the perpetration of the Nakba. That's the thing. It goes right the way back to Balfour, and successive governments have held to that historical policy line. That's the first thing. The second thing is, why isn't it more independent even on these days when we're watching the horrors that are taking place in Gaza? And yes, that is, I think, linked to, first of all, Biden and now Trump, and they will not move unless they're enabled to. Any policy development in this country is sanctioned by the US. And I honestly think that I say this to Labour ministers, they have to be careful about their own position, both in history, historical judgment that there will be, but also their legal position at the moment about complicity in what is a genocide. Literally, it's heartrending listening to Labour MPs, particularly the new ones, desperately making appeals to its own government to do the basics, stop the arms supply, break the aid blockade, recognize the Palestinian state. And the responses we're getting from ministers, they make me angry. And that's why in some instances I will almost lose my temper.
I go to my local Labour Party meeting, and my experience locally is that the government's lost the party on this. Starmer's completely lost the membership on this one. Is the pressure beginning to tell on our MPs? Don't they know that they've got, that we see from opinion polls in the country, and when we're allowed to debate the issue in the Labour movement, like the TUC the other day, we see them adopting an excellent position. Don't they know that they're completely isolated and in disgrace?
Well, interesting. It's when there's a discussion or statement on Gaza, Palestine, the Middle East, the banks of Labour MPs are packed. And it's interesting, across the political perspective in the PLP, more and more people now are getting up and saying, we can't go on like this, we can't go on like this. And I think that's as a result of, yes, them all coming to their own individual judgments, of course, as human beings, but it's also as a result of the expressions of concern and absolute solidarity that's coming from, yes, rank and file Labour Party members and supporters, but the wider community as well. So that I'm pleased that pressure is being exerted on Labour MPs, and it is changing the attitude and atmosphere within the PLP. But it hasn't changed the attitude within the cabinet. That's the tragedy on all of this. As you get older, literally on your deathbed, do you really want to look back and think, what have I done with my life? And one of the roles I played was as a Labour minister that enabled this genocide to take place. Of course you don't. So it's trying to shake them up and to act responsibly, really, and reflect popular opinion in our country. I think it will be one of the factors. If they don't change, I think it will be one of the factors that actually this government will be defeated on eventually. They won't be re-elected in many constituencies purely and simply because of the issue of Gaza.
Now let's look at how the left is shaping up in Britain today. I think we have to be frank that the post-Corbyn left has fragmented. Momentum and the Socialist Campaign Group, people such as ourselves, are sticking it out in the Labour Party. Jeremy and Zara are setting up a new party. And Zach Polanski is trying to turbocharge the Greens with eco-populism. But John, I don't know what you feel like, but I feel like all the people I've just spoken about are my friends. What should we do?
They all are. First, I welcome the election of Zach Polanski. I've met him a few times and I've been on a couple of platforms with him. So I welcome that because he's reinvigorating the Green Party and he's introducing into the Green Party more socialist practice as well, which I think is really helpful. That's the first thing. When he was elected leader in his press conference, he was asked a question about electoral pacts. And what he said, I'll credit John McDonnell with this. I don't want to steal his language.
I saw that.
He says what John said is that we have intellectual coalitions and alliances, and I think that's exactly where we need to be, really. With regard to Jeremy and Zara, both of them would be in the Labour Party as Labour MPs now if they weren't forced out. I think
the time it took Jeremy to make his move indicates he was incredibly reluctant, and his natural home would have been in the party with us.
Jeremy and I have been in the Labour Party 50 years. He wants to be. I've kept saying to Starmer time and time again, you do not underestimate how popular Jeremy is within the country itself, and he's a huge electoral asset. And that what you should be doing is welcoming back into the party, have a rapprochement. And it's the same with Zara. Jeremy and Zara were forced out. So it was inevitable. So what do? Well, Jeremy stands as an independent and wins his seat. And then they look at what political formation they need to take their ideas forward. So again, what I've said there, I'd rather they were in the party. I'd rather the Labour leadership, either now or in the immediate future, as soon as possible, welcomes them back in. But in the meantime, if they establish the party, we've got to recognise that we face an incredibly dangerous moment. This is a dangerous moment. We've got the potential, the election of a far-right government. Yeah, I've been criticised for calling it proto-fascist. They said, "Oh, you compared Farage with Hitler and all." No, I haven't. I've not called reform fascist. What I've said in the technical definition of proto-fascism is that there are the ingredients there that could lead to fascism if we're not careful, if people don't wake up. And so I think the potential of reform being elected is such a dangerous moment. We've got to recognize that wherever we are, whatever political party or movement we're in, we need a popular front against this. And so I've been saying to people, I'm going to remain within the Labour Party. And my view in the Labour Party, you know what it's like. Change could appear. We're not happy with the current leadership, not happy with much of what they're doing, and the huge mistakes that they've made. But change can occur in the Labour Party almost overnight in some instances. And people will say, how? Well, that's how Jeremy got elected. No one thought Jeremy Corbyn would ever become leader of the Labour Party, but it happened. So change can be brought about within the Labour Party. And I'm sticking within the Labour Party because it is my party. I've been in it longer than most of those people who are currently in the Labour leadership. And what I want to do is bring about change within that party. Now, you know, they might expel me. I don't know. I've not lost the whip. They might kick me out. But for as long as I'm within the party, I'll be campaigning to a change. Because whatever people think, a large majority of working class people do still associate with the Labour Party. Less and less now because of the behaviour of the existing government, but many of them still do. So I still think there's hope, and there's still the link with the trade union movement as well, which is the basis of working class activity for many people. So, but having said all that, my appeal is that wherever you are, we're faced with this dangerous threat. We've got to work together. So whether you're in the Greens or within the New Your Party, whether you're in the Labour Party or the trade unions or any progressive movement or any civil society organisation that is a progressive nature, we've got to work together on a common front and populist front. I keep reminding people in the 1930s, the reason the Nazis got into power was because the Communist Party and the Social Democrats refused to cooperate initially. You know, there was the United Front policy from the Communist Party, which was saying we'll have a united front as long as we dominate it. And the Social Democrats refused to participate. It was only later in the 30s that the Popular Front emerged, but by then it was too late. The Nazis were in power. What I'm trying to say is wake up. You do not, I'm not talking about Nazis, I'm talking about the far right. You do not want them in power. So what you need to do is work together to prevent that. And there's a whole range of different campaigns that we can work together on. One of them at the moment is the protection of asylum seekers and develop a campaign to ensure that we maintain the role of this country as welcoming asylum seekers into our country and provide them with comfort and succor and solidarity. I don't want to get involved in any of these ridiculous sectarian arguments about whether you're in the Labour Party or not, or which party you're in. At the moment, it's such a dangerous moment, it's irrelevant. That's a secondary discussion. It's more about what are our objectives and how can we work together and achieve those objectives.
And I think that's a message that people can take, whether they're like you and I, very much staying within the Labour Party, or whether they're on the Green left or in the new party, our party. We must push back against people that want to be sectarian and divided. Yeah. When it comes to Heathrow, when it comes to the climate change, when it comes to Gaza, trade union disputes, housing campaigns, we must remain united. Anyway, that's a great place to bring the first half to a close, John. John will be back in a moment to discuss Labour's future, the deputy leadership contest, and he's going to name his class hero of the month. If you're enjoying the podcast, please help us with our promotion. Please give us a like and a follow. Every comment draws the podcast to a wider potential audience. Please share it with your friends, as it is people like you that can get the podcast to a much wider audience. Hit subscribe now to make sure you never miss an episode of the podcast. Follow our sponsors at Labour Hub and their excellent news site. The October episode of the Labour Left podcast will be with Mark Perriman to talk about his excellent new book, The Starmer Symptom. Now it's back to John. John, we did a lot of scene setting and looking back at the history in the first part. Now let's look at where the Labour Party is. Let's turn our attention to Labour. You had a very interesting article in The Guardian recently where you said the Labour Party is facing one of its most dangerous moments in history, possibly an existential threat. not only are we adrift in the polls, losing one election after another, but the leader's popularity has plummeted. But the main threat comes from the xenophobic hard right in the shape of Reform UK. What did you mean when you wrote existential threat?
My view is the threat from reform is such that we could not just lose a Labour government, we could lose the support and confidence that working class people have in the Labour Party itself, where working class people can look at the Labour Party and say, it doesn't represent me. You can see it fragmenting already. A lot of the concerns that we have are about the election of a far-right government, and that's undoubtedly true. And it builds upon the sort of base that they established around the Brexit vote in particular in some areas. The concern that I have is that if the reform bill's the way it is, it elects a reform government, people will then look back and think what a failure Labour was in government and it failed to protect us. And they will no longer look to the Labour Party as their main voice in the democratic system. That's the existential threat.
I wondered whether you were going down the sort of Passokification route, the idea that the Greek Socialist Party actually self-destructed and ceased at one point to barely exist. We've first past the post. Is there a danger with the so-called wide but shallow majority that we're facing an even greater cliff we could fall off?
If you look at all the evidence, and this is why I think it is an existential threat. In that article, I said the first thing to do is just stop making huge policy mistakes. They seem to have systematically alienated section after section of our support.
I want to get on to the deputy leadership, John, but I think we must say as the left what our stance is on proportional representation, because if we're going to stop reform in their tracks, that's got to be one of the tools. Could you quickly just put on record what your stance is on PR?
I've been an advocate for proportional representation now for over a decade. I was a first past the post system up until then. And then I looked at our society and I thought, actually, what we need to do is two things: be truly representative overall, and not have this situation as in the last election. You can have, a government elected on, well, they had less votes than Jeremy got at the last election to get elected itself. So you needed a fairer system overall. But in addition to that, you needed a system where there was a range of representation that genuinely represented the different political currents within our society. And I think if you look at in our society in particular, in our community in particular, the majority of the different political currents, if you put them together, they actually are progressive, left rather than right. And on that basis, we could prevent the rise of the far right if we had a proportional representation system. Of course, it would mean that the far right would get some seats because there's an element of that support within the country. But I believe with PR, you wouldn't allow one party to dominate the political agenda in Westminster on the basis of getting such a narrow majority, if you like. So I've been a strong advocate for it. And it's interesting enough, a large number of people have come to that view. I saw that Andy Burnham now has come out in favour of PR. And again, if you're looking at the future of the Labour Party, there are people like Andy who may well be in positions of influence that will enable that to happen.
So the deputy leadership, let's talk about the Labour deputy leadership contest. We had a nominations threshold of 80 MPs, which they pushed through conference that they in the right wing just after Keir Starmer got elected. The time for MPs to even think was rushed to stop the party influencing them. And there's only one round of nominations to try and favour the leadership's payroll vote and discriminate against any more challenging candidates. John, why do the Labour leadership dislike the Labour Party membership so much? Why do they go to such lengths to stop us having our say?
We have a Labour Party leadership that's terrified of its own members. That's what the reality is, isn't it? Yeah. And they know that if the members had a opportunity of voting for candidates presenting the broad church, left, right and centre, they know that the result of that election almost certainly would be a left candidate being elected. Even though we've lost a couple of 100,000 members, still the bulk of our membership are to the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And I think the Labour leadership is absolutely terrified of enabling our members to elect someone who might actually be their voice. So we're in this ludicrous position, I should say, where we have a deputy leadership election, where there's 3 days in which to nominate. So there's no time to go back in the normal way for MPs to meet with their constituencies, consult their members and take their views into account. That's the first thing. As you say, the threshold was doubled from 40 to 80 to 20%. And that was very specific, and it was blatant as well. This is a way in which we block a left candidate coming onto the agenda. That was the whole thing. Well, we're now in this farcical situation where 2 people will tour the country, eliciting the votes of party members and trade unions, etc. And there isn't a cigarette paper you can put between the 2 people.
John, I was hoping today that somebody who remembers the Cold War, that you might have been a Kremlinologist and you could have discerned the political difference between Lucy and Bridget. What is the difference? Is one of them, what is the political difference? I can't spot it.
Well, let's just run through the key decisions over the last year. Did they both vote on the issue of scrapping winter fuel allowance? Yes, they did. Did they both not support the scrapping of the 2-child limit? Yes, they did. Did they both support the disability benefit cuts? Yes, they did. And what's their position on Gaza? Exactly the same. So what's the choice there for
one of them's Northern, John. You're forgetting one of them's Northern.
No, they're both Northern.
They're both Northern. Sorry.
One's Northwest.
Even that difference has gone.
Oh, is that? But one's Northwest and one's Northeast. Do you think that's the deciding factor? This is ludicrous, isn't it? This is people have said this is a stitch up. It's, I know a stitch up when I see one. This is it. The good thing about it, at least we had a Socialist Campaign Group candidate.
Yeah, let's have a word for Bell. You took your turn on the rotor in the dark years of Blairism, and Bell took her turn on the rotor this year. Yeah. I thought she did a fantastic job over those few days. To see a socialist on Newsnight was a revelation. It was a tribute to Bell.
She was articulate. She wouldn't be browbeaten in any of those interviews. She just put the ideas across in a very sort of confident way, but in a very clear communication of what a programme that she stood on. And actually, if you look at the responses to it, people say, well, that's the sort of socialism I'm talking about. That's what we need. And in comparison with the other candidates who just recited the same old lines, I just think the Labour Party sort of missed a trick on this one, because I think the general public would welcome a wider debate, and Keir Starmer would, in some ways, allowing a wider range of candidates would have demonstrated that he's more comfortable in his own position. He doesn't have to stitch things up in this way. But anyway, it's been done, and I think, again, it's a setback for the party, but we'll move forward. The good thing now is...
I thought one of the things that Bell did that said it all for me, there was the huge row about Pete Mandelson broke, and she was the first person to call for his resignation.
In December 24, I put on social media that the appointment of Peter Mandelson will call into question Keir Starmer's sense of judgment, basically, and that's exactly what it's done. And Bell was very clear on all of this when no one else was amongst those candidates. She was very clear. Yeah, I think she's risen in a lot of people's estimation, and she's a good reflection of the new generation, particularly of young women that are coming through on the left.
So finally, John, the big question. You've appeared in the Labour Left podcast Hall of Fame of Class Heroes of the Month, but modestly you suggested that other people might have a greater case for being in the Class Hero Hall of Fame. So, John, who is going to be your Class Hero of the Month?
The person I want to nominate is an old friend of mine who's passed away a while back, and his name is David Graeber. David Graeber is an anarchist, was an anarchist, anthropologist, and some of his work I think is, my own view, I think intellectually, his work is so stimulating, but it is groundbreaking and challenging and unique, novel ideas. And then when you've read one of his books, it's always one of those things that, the best books, when you come away from them thinking, well, I thought that, but I've never really read it before. There's that sort of thing, you agree and think, well, why didn't I say that? It's that sort of thing. And he comes from a unique perspective as an anarchist and anthropologist of looking at issues that we're addressing, but he brings that expertise, that in some ways the breadth of his understanding, but he always has a unique analysis of it that stimulates me. David Graeber, I think when people read his work, and I think it's beginning to become much more appreciated now, I think when they read his work, they'll realise actually he was quite an intellectual giant for our period.
Going back to the beginning of our interview, John, when we talked about Gramsci had this notion of the organic intellectual, that wasn't just in some kind of university far away from the struggle. The true organic intellectual is it understands the importance of ideas and takes them into the struggle. And I thought that your choice during the Occupy movement, he demonstrated how to do that, didn't he?
Well, I first met him. I think I first met him when it was after climate camp in my constituency. There was a group that squatted a piece of land and they turned it into a market garden for the whole local community, and they put up PPs and different structures on the land. And I was invited down. They were holding seminars about different aspects. And I first heard David. I walked onto the site and there was a structure and a group of about 50 people sitting down on the haunches listening to this voice. And it was David Graeber's voice. And I'd never met him before then. And I went in and listened to him. After that, I started reading him more. And then met him at virtually every demonstration or whatever. As you say, Occupy was important then. And we just became friends, firm friends on different marches and on different platforms, etc. But he just had a unique analysis and it was always stimulating. But you'd come away, and it was this Gramsci thing, as I said, you come away and you think, well, that's common sense. David Graeber, a huge loss when he died. It was a shock when he died. No one expected it. It came suddenly. But yeah, David Graeber.
Terrible loss and a great choice, John. If you were to guide listeners and watchers to one of his books, which one would you choose?
The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. Okay. But if you want something that's a short but fascinating one, there's a typical David Graeber. He did a really good on pirates. It's called Pirate Enlightenment, and it's a short book, but it's fascinating, in which he demonstrates that actually pirates operated basically on a democratic basis and were more effective as a result. It's just an interesting book, really. But his reading was so extensive. He's a polymath in many ways, even though he'd never accept titles like that. He was a very modest person, but his reading was absolutely stimulating. He wrote the other book, that one of his last books as well, and this is, I'm a bit upset about this. He wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs. Yeah. And he sent me the draft and all the rest. And they said, could I do a blurb for it and all the rest? But it was in the middle of the bloody general election, 2019. So I didn't have time for doing it then. But they reproduced it. And I did a little blurb, but that was after he died, unfortunately. But Bullshit Jobs, I think, is really fascinating. It basically says, really, all of us want to do a job which is stimulating, often with our hands, our skills or whatever, But what we've done is we've invented all these bullshit jobs of managerial jobs of different sorts and all the rest of it. It's a bit like Prem Seeker says, you know, we've produced more accountants in this country than the rest of Europe. God knows what they're doing apart from advising on tax avoidance. It's that sort of thing, you know. That's the nature of rentier capitalism, isn't it, really? And I think that ties in with David Graeber's analysis too. But yeah, I'd urge people to read him because he's got some brilliant ideas. And again, he comes at it. It is an anarchist position, but again, the one that I treasure because it is all about individuals coming together as a community, not requiring the state in many respects to ensure that they can develop the quality of their existence and do it in a way which respects democratic and human rights.
So, John, that brings us to the end of the interview, and it's been a fantastic interview. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope we showed that two old lefties can, even in the dire circumstances we face today, can face what we've got to do with humour and a smile.
We certainly can. We might be a bit rambling at times, but I'm sorry about that.
So, John, thanks very much, and good luck at conference. You'll need it.